So if you were a wildly successful merchant in the early 1500s, right, and you're commissioning this massive masterpiece for your local cathedral, the ultimate display of your absolute undeniable power wasn't gold.
Right. Which is wild to think about.
Yeah. I mean, gold was expensive, obviously. But if you truly wanted to just devastate your rivals, you demanded the artist paint the Virgin Mary's robes using a pigment called ultramarine.
The ultimate status symbol.
Exactly. And to get that specific blue, workers had to extract a semi-precious stone lapis lazuli from the side of a mountain in the just incredibly remote Sarai Seng mines of Afghanistan.
Yeah. And then it had to be hauled across the Silk Road.
Right. Treacherous, bandit-filled routes, perilous sea voyages until it finally hits the docks of Venice, and then it's ground down by hand in this agonizingly slow alchemical process. By the time that blue dust actually touched the canvas of, say, Leonardo or Raphael,
it probably cost more than gold.
It cost more than gold. So you weren't just looking at paint, you know? You were looking at global dominance, astronomical wealth, and honestly, immense human suffering, all mashed into a single brushstroke and entirely disguised as a religious devotion.
It completely shatters that illusion we often have of art history, doesn't it?
Oh, totally.
We think of it as this serene, purely aesthetic progression of pretty pictures. But when you look closely at the materials or the geometry and the shifting proportions of the human figure, you aren't just looking at changing tastes. Right. You are looking at raw, unfiltered human psychology. You were looking at trauma, economics, and raw power.
And that is precisely the psychological landscape we are pulling you into today. I want you to mentally step out of whatever you are doing right now. Just imagine you are walking through the magnificent, light-filled galleries of the Louvre, Abu Dhabi.
Oh, it's such a stunning space.
It really is.
Yeah.
And you are standing in front of these towering, ancient panels of wood and canvas. We are using a brilliant Smart History documentary script and a docent audio guide as our roadmap today. But our mission isn't to give you some dry tutorial on painting techniques.
Yeah, not at all.
We are here to decode a monumental threshold in human consciousness.
Yeah, because it really is the story of an agonizing but intensely beautiful transition. We are going to trace how Western humanity moved from a rigid, flattened, highly terrified worldview.
Extremely terrified.
Right, one entirely obsessed with the divinity of the afterlife.
Yeah.
And how they moved from that into the dynamic, mathematically rational, and unapologetically human-centric explosion of the Renaissance.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to truly understand a shift this massive, we have to start by completely stripping away our modern assumptions about how the universe works.
Which is hard to do.
It's so hard. But if we walk into the earliest galleries, looking at the Romanesque and early Gothic period, so roughly the 11th to the 13th centuries, there is a visual language that just hits you immediately.
Yeah.
Unavoidable.
Yeah. The figures in these artworks are incredibly flat. They are elongated, stretched out, almost like taffy, and they look completely weightless. Gravity literally does not exist in these paintings.
They exist in a strictly two-dimensional universe, and it is so crucial to understand why the artists did this.
Right, it wasn't a mistake.
Exactly. People often think, oh, it's a lack of technical skill.
Yeah.
Like artists in the 12th century simply didn't know how to draw a realistic apple or a dimensional human hand.
Like they just forgot how to draw.
Right. But it wasn't that at all. It was a deeply intentional philosophical choice to reject physical reality entirely.
Wow.
Yeah. To the medieval mind, the physical world that you and I inhabit every day, the dirt, the flesh, the changing of the seasons, that was not something to be celebrated.
Or even closely observed.
Exactly. It was a painful, transient place. I mean, I like to think of it as a waiting room. You're just sitting in this uncomfortable, disease-ridden, miserable chair of earthly existence, literally just staring at the clock, waiting for your number to be called so you can go to the actual important place.
Which is the afterlife.
Right.
That is the perfect way to conceptualize it. The true reality, I mean, the only reality that possessed any permanence or meaning was the spiritual realm.
Yeah.
And because that belief was absolute, art was not meant to be a mirror reflecting the visible everyday world.
I mean, why would it be? If the physical world is just a fleeting distraction, why would you waste precious time and resources painting like an accurate landscape?
You wouldn't. Instead, art functions as a visual textbook. The Latin term is Biblia Paupernum, which means the pauper's Bible.
The pauper's Bible.
Yeah. It was a tool of pure instruction for an entirely illiterate congregation. The walls of the church essentially had to do the heavy lifting of theology.
And because the goal was strictly instruction, not observation, The artists used a very specific visual language to make sure the illiterate viewer understood exactly who was in charge.
Right.
They used what is called hieratic scale. And this is one of those concepts that once you see it, you will never be able to unsee it in a museum.
Oh, it's everywhere once you know to look for it.
Yes. In hieratic scale, physical size has absolutely zero relationship to physical space. Size is dictated entirely by spiritual importance.
Exactly. The more divine power a figure holds, the larger they are painted.
So you have Christ, or the Virgin Mary, dominating the absolute center of the panel as these towering, massive, unmoving giants.
It's looming over everything.
Right. And then the ordinary humans, the peasants, or, even the wealthy donors who actually paid for the painting, they're relegated to the extreme margins.
Tiny little details.
They are these tiny, insignificant, miniature figures hovering around the edges of the giant's feet. It is exactly like a corporate hierarchy chart.
A corporate hierarchy chart.
Yeah, just think about how we map out power today. You look at an aggressive corporate org chart, right?
Yeah, I'm with you.
The CEO is in this massive box at the top center. The middle managers are in smaller boxes below them, and the entry-level employees are in the tiniest boxes at the very bottom.
Right.
The chart doesn't care if the entry-level employee is physically a 7-foot-tall bodybuilder and the CEO is a 5-foot-tall guy.
That's true.
The chart ignores physical reality entirely to show you the power structure. Size dictates importance. So hieratic scale is basically just a medieval infographic of the divine org chart.
That is a brilliant analogy.
Yeah.
It really is a spiritual infographic. And what is most telling about this infographic is the complete and utter lack of human agency.
Oh, absolutely zero agency.
When you look at a medieval painting governed by hieratic scale and flat, weightless space, humanity is not in the driver's seat.
No.
The physical world is just a blank, often solid gold backdrop, like a 2D stage where immense, terrifying divine forces just act upon you.
You are just a tiny, insignificant, marginal figure, hoping the giant figures in the center have mercy on you when you finally leave the waiting room.
Exactly.
It is a deeply pious, incredibly rigid worldview. It strips you of any illusion of control. And, if you were living in Europe in the 12th or 13th century, this power structure seemed absolute.
Unbreakable.
Right, permanent. The heavens were in supreme control, the church was their earthly management, and the earthly waiting room was just something you endured.
It seemed completely permanent until the foundation of that entire psychological universe was violently ripped away.
Yeah.
Because a society does not simply wake up one morning and decide to abandon a millennium of religious rigidity.
No, you need a massive push.
It requires a catalyst. And that catalyst arrived with apocalyptic force between 1347 and 1351.
The Black Death. We really, really have to force ourselves to sit with the sheer unfathomable scale of this catastrophe.
It's hard to even wrap your head around it.
It is. This pandemic swept across Europe and annihilated an estimated 1/3 of the entire population in just a few years.
1 in 3 people.
1 in 3. Just gone.
It is almost impossible for us to comprehend the trauma of that level of loss today.
Yeah.
I mean, we are talking about entire towns wiped out, the complete shredding of the social fabric, the sudden collapse of agriculture and trade.
Just stopped.
Everything. And remember, the mindset we just discussed, this was a society that viewed absolutely every event through the lens of divine will.
Right.
So when this hellscape descended upon them, what do you think they did? Terrified populations naturally flooded the churches.
Which makes total sense, because if you are in the 2D waiting room and the walls are literally caving in, you go to the waiting room's management.
Exactly.
You go to the priests, you pray for salvation, you beg for intervention, you ask what you did to anger the giants in the center of the painting.
But the reality they met inside those churches was chilling.
Yeah.
Despite the prayers, despite the endless masses, the heavens remained entirely silent.
And that silence was deafening. But the true psychological earthquake, the thing that cracked the medieval mindset forever, wasn't just the sheer number of the dead, right? It was who was dying.
Yes, the most devout clergy, the monks, the parish priests, the bishops, the very people who were supposed to be the direct conduits to God, perished just as horribly and in just as great of numbers as the poorest peasants in the fields.
The plague did not respect the hieratic scale.
No, it did not.
It didn't care if you were the Pope or a tiny figure on the margin. It killed everyone equally.
Huh.
But here is where my brain gets stuck.
Okay.
If the heavens are completely silent and the priests are dying right alongside you and the church completely fails to stop the apocalypse, how does society not just instantly collapse into total atheism?
That's a fair question.
Right. because I would look at the sky and say, okay, the gig is up. None of this is real.
What's fascinating here is that human psychology is rarely that clean. They did not abandon their faith entirely. No, they still deeply believed in God, in heaven, and in hell. The trauma was just too fresh to abandon the concept of the soul. But, and this is the massive philosophical pivot, their blind reliance on the church as an institution was utterly shattered.
Okay, so
Yeah.
the CEO is still real, but the middle management has completely lost its credibility.
Exactly. The medieval populace began to ask terrifying existential questions. Has God abandoned us? Well, yes, perhaps. Can the church actually save us?
And the answer to that was obviously no.
Right. When the undeniable, visible answer to that second question became a resounding no, a massive psychological shift occurred. The blinders came off.
This triggers what our deep dive source material refers to as the birth of an urgent secular pragmatism.
It's such a great phrase.
I really want to chew on that phrase. Urgent secular pragmatism. It is the realization of extreme random mortality, but completely stripped of the comforting blanket of institutional salvation.
It is a profound pivot in human consciousness. The new mindset taking root was essentially, we might die tomorrow of this horrific disease, and the priest cannot save us. Therefore, we must find value in the earthly moments of today.
We must find value in the earthly moments of today. I mean, that is a complete 180-degree turn from the 2D waiting room.
Completely.
For centuries, the earth was just this filthy, painful place you aggressively ignored while keeping your eyes locked on the heavens. Now, because death is so random and the afterlife feels suddenly unmanageable by earthly institutions, you start looking around you.
You have to.
You look at the dirt, the architecture, your family, your city. You are looking at the here and now.
You start to value the human experience for its own sake. You start to care about physical beauty, earthly achievements, and legacy, because the promise of the future is terrifyingly uncertain.
Yeah.
The institutions that promise to manage that future have failed. And this deeply painful psychological shift laid the critical groundwork for the Renaissance. Without the fracturing of that blind institutional faith, the cultural gaze would never have descended from the heavens.
But this shift wasn't just happening in people's minds, right? If you suddenly wipe out a third of the population, the entire math of civilization changes.
Oh, absolutely.
And that brings us to the economics of survival.
Yes, because when you have a massive sudden population drop, but the physical resources of the world remain exactly the same, the arable land, the gold reserves, the trade routes, the physical infrastructure, those resources suddenly become wildly concentrated in the hands of the survivors.
So by the time we fast forward to the late 14th and 15th centuries, the political and economic power has dramatically shifted. It is no longer just centralized with the monarchy or locked up in the church's coffers.
No, it has shifted downward, relatively speaking, to the secular merchant classes and powerful artisan associations known as guilds.
Guilds!
Yeah. Guilds were essentially highly organized, incredibly powerful, and honestly ruthless trade unions and monopolies.
Yeah.
They controlled the banking systems, the wool trade, silk manufacturing, stone carving, maritime shipping, everything.
And these newly wealthy merchants and guild masters had a very different relationship with the church than their ancestors did before the plague.
Oh, completely different.
Right. They are flush with this concentrated post-plague cash, and they aren't just handing it over as alms to the church in blind obedience anymore.
No, they wanted something to show for it.
Exactly. They are stepping into the role of visionary patrons. They are essentially declaring, we have the money, we have the earthly power, and we are going to hire the greatest master artists directly. We are going to bypass the clergy entirely to create the most magnificent altarpieces the world has ever seen.
They took absolute control of the artistic production.
Wow.
The church was still the location for the art, of course, but the guilds and the merchants were holding the purse strings and dictating the contracts. And this profoundly transformed what art actually was.
It's the ultimate Renaissance flex.
That is a great way to put it.
That's the only way to describe it. It is like a modern tech billionaire buying a fleet of hypercars, parking them in the middle of a public square, but somehow aggressively framing it as an act of humble public charity.
Yes.
It is a blatant, unapologetic display of secular, earthly wealth, completely masquerading as a religious devotion.
It is the perfect visual embodiment of that urgent secular pragmatism. The merchant is still commissioning religious subjects, Madonnas, crucifixions, saints, so they're definitely securing their spiritual bases for the afterlife.
Covering their bets.
Exactly. But the way these subjects are painted and the materials used to paint them are designed to scream to every single person in the city, just how rich and powerful the patron is in the here and now.
Which brings us back to that incredible materiality we talked about at the very beginning of the deep dive, the ultramarine blue. Because when cost is absolutely no object, the competition for status becomes unhinged.
Truly unhinged.
They would mandate that the backgrounds of these paintings be covered in brilliant gold, actual gold, pounded astonishingly thin and literally glued to the wood panel.
And gold was the traditional symbol of divine light, of course. But as you mentioned earlier, it wasn't the peak of extravagance.
Not even close.
No, the true symbol of supreme status, the ultimate flex of the secular merchant, was lapis lazuli.
I cannot get over the logistics of this. It is pure madness. We are so used to walking into a hardware store today, picking a color swatch and having a machine mix it in 30 seconds.
Right, it's effortless for us.
But in the 15th century, to get that specific vibrating electric blue for the Virgin Mary's robes, you are initiating a global supply chain of immense danger.
Yes. The Sari-Sang mines in the Badakhshan province of Afghanistan were the only known source on the planet at that time.
The only source.
The only one. So you have miners extracting this incredibly dense rock in a brutal high-altitude environment. It is then packed onto beasts of burden and transported across the treacherous Silk Road.
I mean, just imagine the journey.
It has to cross deserts, navigate mountain passes, pass through countless middlemen, avoid bandits, and survive perilous sea voyages across the Mediterranean just to finally arrive at the docks of Venice.
And once it gets to Venice, the work isn't even close to done. You can't just crush up a blue rock, mix it with egg yolk or oil, and slap it on a canvas.
No, if you just crush lapis lazuli, it turns into a dull, grayish powder because of all the impurities in the stone.
Right. So the artisans had to meticulously grind the stone down by hand, mix it with melted wax, resins, and oils into this dough-like ball, and then knead this dough in a weak lye solution.
It sounds like baking, but way more toxic.
Right. The lye would draw out the pure blue particles into the water, while the wax held onto the gray impurities, and they would do this over and over, extracting different grades of blue. It was an agonizingly slow, highly specialized alchemical process. The labor, the danger, and the sheer time embedded in just 1 ounce of this pigment is staggering.
So when a merchant patron sits down with a master painter, draws up a legally binding contract, and explicitly stipulates that the artist must use vast amounts of genuine ultramarine for the Virgin's robes, it isn't just a nice stylistic choice.
No, it's a power move.
It is a massive, aggressive declaration of earthly dominance. They are taking the absolute pinnacle of individual worldly power, the ability to command the furthest reaches of global trade, and permanently embedding it into a sacred image.
You are looking at a painting of a supposedly humble biblical figure, but her physical form is constructed from astronomical earthly wealth.
This raises an important question, though.
Okay.
If these secular patrons are spending unimaginable wealth to showcase their worldly power and their earthly existence, the old medieval style isn't going to work anymore, is it?
Oh, right. The flat, 2D, weightless, hovering stick figures of the waiting room cannot hold the ego of a wealthy Renaissance guild merchant.
They cannot. If you are conquering the physical world, manipulating global trade, and accumulating vast wealth, you want to see the real world reflected back at you in your art.
You want realism.
Yes, the immense wealth of the guilds was the fuel, but the engine that truly changed the visual style was a radical new philosophy that emerged from that post-plague pragmatism.
Humanism.
Humanism. It is the radical philosophical belief that mankind is not just a filthy, miserable creature waiting for death.
Right.
Mankind is a beautiful, rational, highly capable creation of God. Therefore, the physical world, the earth, our bodies, our cities, the laws of physics, is actually worthy of intense scientific study.
It's a complete flipping of the script. In the medieval period, studying the physical world or admiring the human body was considered a sinful distraction from the divine.
Exactly, it was vanity.
But under humanism, studying the physical world, understanding its mathematics, its geometry, and its beauty is the ultimate way to honor the divine, because God made it and God made us rational enough to understand it.
The cultural gaze finally descends from the distant heavens down to the earth. And when that gaze hits the earth, it demands a completely new way of seeing. It demands accuracy, rationality, and spatial logic.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the shift isn't just a slow, gradual evolution. We can pinpoint an exact year and an exact person who hands humanity the visual key to the physical world.
Yes, we can.
The year is 1415, and the person is a Florentine architect named Filippo Brunelleschi. He codified what is essentially the most powerful magic trick in the history of art: linear perspective.
It is very difficult for us today, swimming in a world of 3D rendering and photography, to overstate how revolutionary Brunelleschi's codification was.
Because we just take it for granted.
We do. Before 1415, artists struggled immensely to create a convincing illusion of depth. They would overlap figures or they would try to angle buildings, but it always looked a bit tilted, intuitive, and ultimately flattened.
Like the buildings are sliding off the canvas.
Exactly. It was guesswork. Brunelleschi didn't just improve their technique. He discovered the underlying, unforgiving mathematics of human vision.
We need to break down this math because it is the foundational code of the Renaissance. It all centers around this concept called the vanishing point.
Right. Brunelleschi realized that to recreate truly accurate 3D space on a completely flat 2D surface, you need to establish a strict geometric system. First, you draw a horizontal line across the canvas. That is the horizon line, which perfectly represents the viewer's exact eye level.
Okay, got it.
On that horizon line, you place a single solitary dot. That is the vanishing point.
So I'm picturing it, a line across the middle, one dot right in the center.
Then the absolute rule of this system is that every single receding line in the painting, whether it is the top edge of a building, the lines of a tiled floor, or the edge of a long banquet table, must be perfectly straight, and they must all mathematically converge exactly at that single dot. These are called orthogonal lines.
So if you draw a line from the top of a painted building into the distance and a line from the bottom of the building into the distance, they both point like arrows directly at that one dot on the horizon.
Yes.
It is an invisible geometric grid locking the entire world into place.
And when an artist enforces that strict mathematical rule across the entire canvas, absolute magic happens. The flat, impenetrable 2D wall of the medieval era suddenly bursts open.
It's incredible.
It becomes a 3D window looking directly into physical space.
Yeah.
You aren't looking at a flat chart anymore. You're looking through a window into a world you could practically step into.
But wait, if you build a mathematically perfect, deeply realistic architectural grid, you can't just slap a hovering, flat, giant medieval stick figure in the middle of it.
No, you can't.
The physics of the painting would literally break. It would look completely absurd.
Precisely. The environment demands a new kind of inhabitant. Once the space becomes rational and three-dimensional, the figures inside it have to change. They suddenly possess anatomical mass.
They have weight.
Yes, they have dense physical weight. Gravity exists again. You begin to see the artists mapping the bones and muscles under the clothing.
And this has a profound theological consequence, because if the space is real and the physics are real, what happens to God?
It changes everything.
Right. The medieval god was a terrifying, abstract icon looming in the center. Now, God and the saints are painted in the idealized image of human beings. They have muscles, they have physical weight, they cast shadows, they look like us.
It is the ultimate visual realization of humanism. Humanity has elevated itself through science, wealth, and pragmatic philosophy to the point where they depict the divine acting within our own mathematically perfect earthly realm. We have brought heaven down to earth and subjected it to the laws of human geometry.
It is just mind-blowing. Brunelleschi basically invents 3D rendering in 1415. He invents this entirely new mathematical system out of thin air to change how we see the world.
Well, let's pause right there.
Wait, did I get it wrong?
Not wrong, exactly. But because it feels incredibly new and revolutionary, and it certainly felt that way for the people living in 15th century Florence, we have to correct a major assumption here. Brunelleschi and his humanist contemporaries weren't actually inventing something entirely new out of thin air.
What do you mean? How could linear perspective and anatomical mass not be new? We just spent the last 20 minutes exploring how the medieval world had absolutely none of it.
The medieval world didn't have it. But the medieval world isn't the beginning of human history. And this brings us to the true meaning of the word Renaissance.
Oh, right. Renaissance literally translates to rebirth. Rebirth, not a new birth, not an unprecedented invention, but the born-again iteration of something that had already existed, died, and was now being resurrected.
Exactly. It is absolutely crucial to understand that this era was not merely the birth of something unprecedented. It was a deliberate, highly ideological, and fiercely intentional return to a foundational standard.
And what was that standard?
Classical Antiquity, the lost world of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans.
Ah, I see. So the artists of the 1400s and 1500s, these wealthy humanist innovators we've been praising, they essentially look right past the medieval period. They looked at the previous 1,000 years of history arrogantly dubbed it the Dark Ages, ignored it entirely, and reached all the way back across the timeline to Greece and Rome.
They viewed antiquity as the ultimate, undisputed gold standard of human achievement. When they wanted to know how to build a perfectly proportioned dome or how to sculpt a realistic human body, they literally dug up Roman ruins in the dirt.
Wow.
They translated lost Greek texts that had been preserved by Islamic scholars. They weren't inventing new proportions, they were reviving ancient mathematical proportions. They were reviving classical architecture, the columns, the perfect hemispherical domes, the triumphal arches.
They were also reviving specific bodily postures. I remember learning this term in an art history survey years ago, Contrapposto.
Yes, Contrapposto.
But I always struggled to understand the mechanics of it. What exactly is a Contrapposto stance, and why does it matter so much?
Okay, so contrapposto is an Italian term that translates to counterpoise. It was a highly sophisticated sculptural technique invented by the ancient Greeks to make statues look relaxed, lifelike, and psychologically engaged.
Okay.
Think about how a medieval statue stands. It stands stiffly, vertically straight, with its weight evenly distributed on both feet.
Which feels completely rigid and artificial. I mean, nobody actually stands like that unless they are standing at military attention.
Right. It lacks life. The Greeks realized that to capture the spark of human life, you have to capture asymmetrical balance. In a contrapposto stance, the figure rests the majority of their physical weight on one leg, the engaged leg.
Like how you stand when you are casually waiting in line for coffee. You pop one hip out, you shift your weight to one solid foot, and the other leg just sort of bends and relaxes.
Precisely. And when you do that, a complex chain reaction happens throughout the entire human body. If your left hip pops up to support the weight, your left shoulder naturally drops down to counterbalance it.
Oh, I see it.
It gives the central axis of the body a subtle, elegant S-curve. It is the perfect harmony of tension and relaxation. The engaged leg is tense, bearing the weight of the world. The free leg is relaxed.
It implies movement. It looks like the statue just shifted its weight a second ago or is about to take a step forward in the next second. It possesses potential energy.
Exactly, potential energy. The Greeks mastered this illusion. The Romans copied it incessantly. The medieval artists either completely lost the technical knowledge to do it or intentionally abandoned it in favor of those stiff, weightless spiritual figures.
Right, because the body was sinful.
Exactly. And the Renaissance artists, studying the fractured marble torsos being dug out of the Italian soil, studied the mechanics of contrapposto and brought it back to life. It was the physical embodiment of the humanist mind, balanced, relaxed, but capable of action.
So this whole explosion of genius in the 1400s and 1500s was actually heavily reliant on mimicking the genius of people who had been dead for over 1,000 years. They were leaning on the ghosts of antiquity to find their way forward.
They absolutely were. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, we discover a truly profound concept. This phenomenon, this act of a society returning to a standard to find its way forward, is not unique to the 1400s.
It is a recurring cyclical mechanism. It happens whenever a culture feels lost, whenever it faces a terrifying transition, or whenever it desperately seeks legitimacy and clarity.
Right.
Instead of looking forward into the terrifying void of the unknown, society looks backward to a perceived golden age to find an anchor.
The Renaissance is not just a single event, it is a pattern. To prove this point, we can look at two massive historical examples that utilize the exact same psychological mechanism, but separated by nearly 2 millennia.
Okay, lay it on me.
Let's look at the first example, the Augustan Revival.
We are jumping way, way back now to the 1st century BCE. We are talking about Octavian, the man who becomes Augustus, the very first emperor of Rome.
Right. Now put yourself in Augustus's sandals. You have just survived and won a brutal, bloody, decades-long series of civil wars. The ancient Roman Republic, the system of government that lasted for centuries, has utterly fallen. You are now the sole dictator, the first emperor.
That's a lot of pressure.
It is, and you have an immense public relations problem. You need to convince the Roman people that your absolute rule is not a horrific tyranny, but rather a glorious, prosperous new era of peace and stability. How do you do that visually?
Well, you definitely don't try to invent a completely new radical artistic language. You don't say, I'm the first emperor, let's invent abstract modern art to show how entirely unprecedented my rule is.
Absolutely not. Because new is terrifying. To a society that has just plagued through decades of civil war, new implies instability, unpredictability, and chaos. Augustus desperately needed legitimacy. He needed to project an image of a guaranteed, unshakable golden age.
So to legitimize his brand new dictatorship, He explicitly ordered his Roman sculptors to look backward. He instructed them to bypass the chaotic art of the recent past and copy the 5th century BCE Greek bronzes. He specifically targeted works like Polykleitos' Doryphorus, which is that famous, mathematically perfect Greek statue of a spear-bearer. Augustus had his artists transform those ancient Greek ideals of perfection and serene balance into pristine, mass-produced Roman marble statues.
He used the classical Greek standard as a tool of raw political propaganda. By literally wrapping himself and his new empire in the visual language of the ancient Greeks, who were universally respected by the Romans as the absolute pinnacle of civilized perfection. Augustus was sending a clear psychological message to his people.
Do not feel my new empire. Under my rule, we haven't invented a tyranny, we have returned to perfection.
Exactly.
He manufactured a golden age by borrowing the aesthetics of an older one. That is incredibly savvy and, honestly, deeply manipulative.
It is brilliant political theater. And the exact same mechanism happens again centuries after the Renaissance, which brings us to our second historical example, neoclassicism.
Okay, so we are fast-forwarding from ancient Rome, past the Renaissance, all the way to the late 18th century, specifically the 1760s through the 1780s. The art world at this time is dominated by something called the Rococo period.
Yes.
And Rococo is the absolute definition of frivolous, aristocratic decadence.
If you want to visualize Rococo art, think of paintings of obscenely wealthy aristocrats in fluffy, shimmering pastel dresses, swinging on velvet swings in lush, overgrown gardens, surrounded by chubby little cupids and excessive floral arrangements.
It's basically a giant pastel cake.
It really is. It is art that is entirely, unashamedly about sensory pleasure, erotic indulgence, and the extravagant, disconnected wealth of the French nobility. It is soft, blurry, and morally vacant.
But simmering underneath this pastel decadence, the intellectuals and the revolutionaries are growing completely disgusted. They are looking at the crippling poverty of the common people in the streets of Paris. They are reading the rational philosophy of the Enlightenment, and they are gearing up for the absolute bloodbath that will become the French Revolution.
Exactly. A society on the brink of total upheaval. And how do these revolutionaries visually revolt against the pastel decadence of the king and queen?
They need a visual language of morality, toughness, and civic duty. But again, they don't invent a new, chaotic visual style out of thin air. They do exactly what Augustus did. They do exactly what Brunelleschi did. They return to the standard once again.
They need a golden age of republican virtue, so they reach right back to the Roman Republic. This is where the artist Jacques-Louis David steps in. To inspire the revolution, he didn't paint futuristic scenes of a new world. He resurrected the harsh, unforgiving visual language of ancient Rome.
He brought back stern, muscular, geometric severity. Jacques-Louis David banished the pastels and the fluffy dresses entirely.
Go on.
If you look at his revolutionary paintings, he uses a technique that completely rejects the blurry softness of Rococo. His brushwork is tight and invisible. He uses harsh, theatrical lighting that cuts across the canvas. He places his figures against stark, severe architectural backgrounds, Roman arches, and unadorned stone walls.
And the subject matter is brutal. He paints ancient Roman soldiers swearing bloody oaths to die for their republic, or Roman fathers stoically receiving the dead bodies of their sons who fell in battle.
It's intense.
Very intense. He is literally using the visual language and the historical mythology of ancient Rome to scream at the French people of the 18th century.
Saying, we have become soft and decadent. We need to be tough, moral, and uncompromising like the ancient Romans were. We need to overthrow these decadent kings and reclaim our civic virtue.
He weaponized the past to create the future. And this is why understanding the concept of rebirth is so vital. The Renaissance is not just a chapter in a history book permanently locked in the 1500s.
It is an eternal human impulse. It is the impulse to look backward, to find a time of perceived perfection, and use it as a springboard to propel society forward.
Yes.
When we get lost in the dark, we don't try to draw a new map from scratch. We try to find an old map that we know worked before, and we trace over it.
We constantly, obsessively recycle our own history to find the confidence to face the future.
Wow. Okay, let's take a breath and bring this all together. Think about the massive, sweeping journey we have just taken through the conceptual galleries of the Louvre Abu Dhabi.
It's been quite a trip.
It really has. We started our journey trapped in a 2D waiting room where humanity possessed zero agency, existing merely as tiny, terrified margin notes in a rigid divine hierarchy.
We witnessed the apocalyptic trauma of the Black Death shatter that institutional hierarchy, forcing a traumatized humanity to look around at their fragile earthly existence with urgent, desperate pragmatism.
We saw the survivors of that plague consolidate unprecedented wealth, forming ruthless guilds and bypassing the church to flex their earthly power. They manipulated global supply chains, dragging lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan across the Silk Road just to grind it into ultramarine blue, proving their dominance over the physical world.
We watched that immense wealth fuel the radical philosophy of humanism, which demanded a rational, mathematical way to view God's creation. That demand led Brunelleschi to crack the unforgiving geometric code of linear perspective, bursting open the flat medieval wall into a mathematically perfect 3D window.
And finally, we realized that to take that massive, terrifying leap forward into modernity, humanity actually had to look backward. They had to reclaim their classical dignity, reviving the Contrapposto stances and ancient proportions of the Greeks and Romans.
It's a full circle.
It is. It proves that our history isn't just about changing styles of paint on canvas. You are reading the ultimate visual diary of human triumph and psychology. From paralyzing despair to mathematical mastery and historical reclamation. It is the story of how we learn to see ourselves.
It is a phenomenal synthesis of human resilience. We adapt to trauma, we study the physics of our reality, and we construct completely new realities out of the fractured rubble of the old.
We've seen how unimaginably powerful this mechanism of rebirth is. Augustus used it to build an empire. The Renaissance masters used it to discover 3D space. Jacques-Louis David used it to fuel the French Revolution.
Exactly.
Every time a society felt lost, decadent, or in desperate need of profound change, they looked backward to a foundational standard of perfection, an undisputed golden age, to anchor themselves before leaping into the void. So what does this all mean?
That is the big question.
It really is. And that leaves me with a thought I want to pass directly to you. Look around at the hyper-complex, rapidly shifting world we live in today. If our society right now felt utterly lost or culturally decadent and decided we desperately needed to trigger our own new rebirth, what previous era would we even choose as our undisputed golden standard?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Right. Where in our messy, complicated history is the anchor we would all universally agree to reach back for? And how would the act of choosing that specific past completely redefine our future? It makes you wonder, when the history of our century is finally written, what diagnostic landscape of our own collective psychology will they see?